seen before on my first trip. I had seen different formations that had seemed impossible to create. One of these instances was on my second day, after a very long day on the lakes and 10 portages. We reached campsite on Cherry Lake. We gathered there, and it was a very interesting rock formation. There were literally 3 separate ledges that just faded off into the campsite, and it was like 3 rocks had just been like split and like shaved off, and it was very interesting. It overlooked a very large bay with 2 giant islands emerging from the depths of the lake. The water was still, and it reflected everything, especially the fading light of the sun as it passed below the tops of the trees. On campsites like these, I was able to step away from my life at home and breathe peacefully and find myself again.
Hello. My name's Alex Stevens, and I was on the Buondary Waters trip, and that's why I'm obviously up here right now. Going into this trip, I would say I was an expert. After all, it was going to be my 3rd trip. It was only going to be my 2nd with the church. I just remember the moment when we pulled out of St. John's. I was so happy, so excited, but then reality set in. I mean, why is the church taking me on a 2-day van ride just to go to a lake? I mean, I can go to Pewaukee Lake, it's right over there, right? After all the complaining passed and new sights started flying outside the windows, it all makes sense. The Buondary Waters is a way to make you feel humbled, even if it's your first trip or even if you're a pro like me. I couldn't tell if it's the magnificent sunsets or the magnitude of land and sea. But God is so many places on this trip for so many different people. I found him in one specific place on one specific night. It was our 3rd night. I was sitting down by the lake on the rocks. And I was just watching as the sun started to go down. Don't get me wrong, I don't like bugs, but I started watching the water spiders that are going on top of the water. As the longer I watched, the farther they got out. And every glide they took, with no care in the world at all, just glide after glide, they kept moving. I mean, let's think about this. Water spiders should only be afraid of a few things: birds and fish. So why do they keep going out farther? Being the philosopher I am, I came to one decision, or conclusion. The water spiders have one life, just like you and I, and instead of hiding from all the fears and possible threats, they venture farther and farther. They're just living their life every chance they get. Every glide they take, the farther out they go. And I came to the conclusion, why am I not doing the same thing? Why am I hiding from the possibility of failing or getting hurt? After all, those are the challenges that allow us to break through our fears and do things that we may never have seen possible. As I said before, God was in many places for many different people, but God showed up for me that night on that rock by the water. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Samantha, and I saw God many times while on the Buondary Waters trip. One example of this was at the end of the first paddle. We had been fighting the waves on Seagull Lake all day and were exhausted. Before we started setting up, I wandered around the camp a bit to see what was there. To my amazement, I found a ginormous patch of blueberry bushes. Blueberries were the perfect thing to cheer us up after a frustrating day. After confirming that they were safe to eat, a fellow groupmate and I went about collecting as many as we could. The blueberries were small but delicious. We picked for about an hour and managed to fill a pan. We brought them back and enjoyed them on our dessert that evening. I also saw God at the end of the portages. I saw him in the glimpse of the blue water standing out against the green of the forest. Seeing that flash of blue, a sense of accomplishment would always wash over me. I would think, I made it. It was hard, but I got through it. This was a common theme throughout the trip. When things got difficult, you could let it go and enjoy the beauty around you, trusting that you would get through it.
Hi all, good morning. My name is Samantha Runkel, and I, in past years, was a member of the St. John's High School Youth Group. With the youth group, I have gone on 3 mission trips and 2 canoe trips. These trips first introduced me to the Buondary Waters and Wilderness Canoe Place, a place that would in turn become incredibly pivotal and informative in my young adult life. I've a unique experience with Wilderness Canoe Base, so excuse me while I take us back a few years. My wilderness experience started the summer of 2015. I, an eager 17-year-old and a rather inexperienced camper, after a bit of motivation from friends and an intense fear of missing out, ventured on my first trip up the Gunflint Trail to Wilderness Canoe Base. My first canoe trip was about as normal as you could imagine. A week of hard work and pushing limits physically, mentally, and emotionally with every new step. After just a few days on trail, I knew my first trip up the Gunflint Trail wouldn't be my last. 2 years later, I recall being slightly impatient and incredibly eager to sign up for the next trip. I was once again thrown into the deep depths of the North Woods with what never seems like enough equipment for 5 nights. Even after round 2, I refused to accept that my second trip up the Gunflint Trail would be my last. Little did I know then that I would make the 546-mile drive from Brookfield, Wisconsin to Grand Marais, Minnesota 8 more times and spend approximately 152 more days at Wilderness Canoe Base, but this time on staff. My latest experience at Wilderness Canoe Base ended less than 24 hours ago. Over the last 3 months, I've had the absolute privilege of being the head cook at Wilderness Canoe Base during my second season on staff, which doesn't give me a lot of motivation to talk in front of crowds, so I'm sorry. This summer, I was often challenged physically, spiritually, and mentally. I not only stepped outside of my comfort zone, but dove, hiked, and paddled far beyond any boundary I've ever known. Usually up before the sun and down long after its daily retreat, I found myself working some of what seemed like the longest days of my life. I've had body aches and muscle tensions I didn't know humans could bear. I've had some of the most hard-hitting, life-questioning, and spiritually challenging conversations. This summer, I was a single moving part of a rather small community gathered on a small island on Seagull Lake on the outskirts of the Buondary Waters. This small community is rooted in hope, joy, love, affirmations, smiles, tears, and at the end of the day, many hugs. I was blessed to share one of my passions for cooking alongside others sharing their much differing passions in a place that we all have a burning passion for. This summer, I watched as our small community grew together and eagerly spread our love for the wilderness, our love of encouragement, and our love for serving others with literal busloads of campers and leaders. This summer, I openly shared my faith in many outlets. Preparing and sharing meals with all of our guests seems like a pretty obvious one, but also leading small reflections in front of not only 30, but 130 people. I was witness to raw and intense emotions from staff and camper alike. This summer, I watched God work in the sunrises and the sunsets, the calm waters and the gusty winds. I saw God in the masses of stars in the glow of a full moon. I saw God work through determined campers, dedicated guides, and an overflowing waterfall of encouragement. I don't necessarily know what comes next for me, but I do know that some 500 odd miles from here, there's a community cheering me on, and I definitely know that my last trip up the Gunflint Trail wasn't my last.
Since my first trip as a high school freshman, the Buondary Waters has always been a special place for me. This was my 9th trip up there, and every trip is so unique and different. Every time I'm there, I'm surrounded by familiarity, but also many new experiences and seeing God in new ways. Although it was my 9th trip, it was still filled with many firsts. It was not my first time on Lake Sag or hearing the dreaded words, "Your permit is for a Sag entrance." For those of you who are not familiar with the Buondary Waters, Sag is the biggest lake we end up on while you're out there. And motorboats are allowed on Sag. On a calm day, you are still paddling into the wind with small waves, and it's exhausting. On a windy day, Sag is a beast. Knowing our group was the only one with a Sag entry point, I said a prayer and hoped for the best. But mid-afternoon on our first day, as we paddled down the Sag Channel, we could see whitecaps in the distance, and we knew Sag was angry. Both me and our guide had never experienced Sag this angry. Our group had 8 people in 3 canoes. I happened to be in the canoe that only had 2 people in it. All day it didn't seem to be an issue, but once we hit the angry water, it became a struggle because we were so much lighter. Our canoe was sitting high on the water, which means no matter how hard we paddled, we barely moved. Then came the speedboats. The boats meant not only fighting the waves, but also fighting the wakes, pushing us closer and closer to shore. Steering with every ounce of strength, we were losing the battle with the waves. Then it happened. More wakes, more waves, and a split-second decision. Bail, or we swamp our canoe. So in the water I went. My canoe partner stayed calm and in the canoe, and drifted into shore. I swam over, got back in, and we tried again. Only moments later, once a few yards from the shore, to end up right back in the water, swimming back to shore. We regrouped and decided as a group to turn back and try again in the morning. Although this was a first for me, looking back, I couldn't believe how calm I stayed throughout the experience. Although it was a scary situation, I knew I would be okay. While paddling back to calmer waters, I thought about the confirmation creed I wrote back in 9th grade and referred to God as a life jacket, keeping you afloat as long as you trust and follow Him. And in those moments, I was so thankful for that life jacket I was wearing, both physically and spiritually. The other first happened for me as soon as we arrived to Wilderness Canoe Base on the mainland. We got out of our vans, and we were greeted by 2 familiar faces, 2 former youth group students who were on staff this summer. I gave Sam a big hug, and then Benji came over and said those 5 magic words, "I'm your guide this week." The first night at dinner, Sam led the camp with a last word devotion and prayer. The junior in high school I brought out to the wilderness 4 years ago was now standing in front of 100+ high school and middle school students, leading them in devotion and prayer. All week, Benji led my small group, both on trail and in devotion. I couldn't help but sit back and watch. Benji was the first confirmation class I had the pleasure of leading since freshman year. I had the pleasure of leading Benji both his sophomore year and senior year in Buondary Waters and on 3 different mission trips. Although still just as goofy, watching him not only lead devotions, but take ownership of his faith and share it with the students in our group was an absolute joy. We had 3 other college students on the trip this summer as well. Watching them help the high school students when they struggled, encouraging them along the way, and helping high school students step outside their comfort zones to grow in faith and friendship by leading by example was something truly special to watch, especially when in turn you saw the high school students encouraging and pushing others. There was not a single portage we were on where I didn't hear students shouting, "You're doing great, you got this, just a few more feet, I can see the water, you can do it." This is why we do these trips. This is why we try to offer these experiences to our youth. This is why I feel so blessed to be called to this ministry. God has blessed this congregation with an amazing group of high school students and young adults, and I thank every one of you who supported them in any way along their journey. Thank you for all of those who prayed for us this week, especially our prayer partners. Thank you to all who helped financially with this trip, and thank you to all the Sunday school teachers, helpers, and parents who helped this group along their journey to get to where they are today.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you all for sharing your experiences. You know, the gospel today talks about, well, Jesus tells his disciples to prepare for the coming of the kingdom. And all of our lives are that preparation. And what I heard in your trip and in your experiences is a great sense of humility. I mean, when you're out there in the middle of that grand beauty, you realize that you're a small part of a much larger design. And to be able to be aware of that is a part of a spirituality that helps us to connect to God, actually God to connect with us. And so it's important with these experiences that you have had, to take that sense of humility to everything that you do, because our whole lives are a preparation for the coming of Jesus. And so the more that we are aware of all that God is doing and how God is doing it, lends us to a rich and faithful life in Christ. And so as Carrie said, thank all of you for providing the resources and the support for our young people to experience this hand of God. So, let us continue our worship service with a hymn, For the Beauty of the Earth. And I ask you to stand, please.